Mr. Secretary General, in many of your speeches on climate, you've laid out all the ways that the planet is in distress and how urgent it is for the world to come together to fight it. But it's been more than 2 decades since the Kyoto Protocol, 5 years since the Paris climate deal, and the world remains off track towards reaching climate goals. What, for you, has been the most frustrating part of getting everyone committed to this fight?
Well, what is frustrating is that 5 years after the Paris Agreement, we are still off track. We are still heading to a temperature growth in the end of the century of 3 to 5 degrees, which would be catastrophic for the world. It would be the destruction of our planet. The Paris Agreement was a remarkable achievement. It brought the world together for the first time with a strong commitment. And the commitment was that we should reduce the temperature at the end of the century by less than 2 degrees, as close as possible to 1.5 degrees and Celsius. And the scientific community has told us that we really must get to 1.5 degrees as a maximum, because if not, the consequences will be devastating. But the commitments made by governments in the Paris Agreement, the immediate commitments, would not lead to this reduction of emissions. They would still lead to something around 3 degrees at the end of the century. And what is more frustrating is that the promises made in Paris, very few countries respected them. Very few countries have fully implemented what they had promised in Paris in relation to their own economies and to their own societies. And so we are off track. And so we see the climate deteriorating everywhere. I mean, we see temperatures rising, we see concentrations of greenhouse gases increasing, we see glaciers melting, the Arctic in a very dramatic situation. We see floods, hurricanes, but drought impacting dramatically, especially with the most vulnerable countries and populations. It's unfair. Those that contribute more to climate change are not those that are paying the highest price. It's the poor people in the poor countries that are paying the highest price. And this is frustrating. Now, in the middle of this frustration, there is a signal of hope. What is the hope? Is that people finally understood that we are going in the wrong direction. And we saw the youth mobilizing everywhere. We saw the public opinions gaining strength in pushing for climate action. We see the business community understanding that it doesn't make sense to have their money in stranded assets that have no future. It's the green economy that has future, not the brown economy. So if you have your investments in coal, you will be losing money in the future. If you have your investments in the green economy, in solar, you'll be making money in the future. And then governments started to understand that we really need to change course. And there are good news. Now, if we consider what has been decided by China, what President Xi Jinping has announced here in the General Assembly, China is committed to reduce its greenhouse emissions to get to net zero emissions before 2060. But we have seen the European Union with the commitment for 2050, together with the UK, together with Japan, with Korea. Now the new American administration has announced that they will also be committed to net zero in 2050. We saw Brazil yesterday announcing its commitment to again before 2060, following the Chinese example. So now we have reasons to believe that governments have understood what we need to do and that things will change. It's like, you know, a car. The car is still going in the wrong direction, but it has already put the red light giving a signal that the car will turn and the car will move in the right direction. And we see, indeed, a change in mindset. We see really people understanding that now is the moment to make peace with nature. We have been at war with nature. And nature strikes back, and strikes back with enormous fury. We all felt the consequences. In China, you had terrible terrible weather events with dramatic impacts. But of course, China is a well-prepared country. It was much worse in countries less well-prepared in the African continent or small islands in the Pacific or the Caribbean, recently in Central America, devastating floods. So it's time to change course, but there is a hope. And let's build on that hope, and let's make sure that we create a global coalition next year, a global coalition for carbon neutrality, for net zero emissions in the middle of the century.
Now, talking about building on that hope and that momentum, as we head into the Climate Ambition Summit, what kind of new commitments do you hope to see exactly? Your wish list, if you may.
Now, it's not enough to make a promise for 2050. That promise for 2050 needs to be supported by commitments in the short term. And we have the next year with the COP26 in Glasgow for countries to present their new enhanced national determined contributions. And China, again, has announced that they will have enhanced national determined contributions. They have announced an anticipation of the moment of the peak of emissions, the Chinese government. And there is a new 5-year plan that will be implemented. And we believe that in Paris there will be a chance for many countries to give a clear perspective that they are indeed, from now, not only waiting for 2050, but from now, adopting the measures that are necessary to make carbon neutrality in the middle of the century a reality. And I hope that this will help create momentum, and I hope that this will help make more and more governments, more and more cities, more and more businesses, more and more financial institutions prepare and present their own transition plans to net zero and take decisions. I mean, time to end fossil fuel subsidies. Now, I pay my taxes. I don't like to see my taxes being used to destroy the planet. We are still having too much bet on coal. Now it is cheaper to produce electricity by new solar power plants, even with the cost of the investment, than just keeping old coal power plants working. So we need to build no more new coal power plants and progressively phase out coal. We need to tax carbon less than people. Today, we pay taxes essentially for our income or for the products we buy. Well, we can reduce those taxes and put a tax on carbon or create a carbon market. China has done so. We need to make sure that the risks related to climate in financial operations are disclosed, that banks, financial institutions need to be climate-related financial disclosures, not to give the impression that those risks do not exist. So there are lots of things that we need to see happening in the near future in order to make sure that countries will be able to deliver in relation to their promise to reach carbon neutrality in 2050, 2060, but in the middle of the century.
China, of course, has an outsized role to play here. It is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, but also the biggest investor in and producer and consumer of renewable energy. You mentioned its commitment to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Does that go far enough? And what more would you like to see from Beijing?
Well, first of all, I think China was essential for the Paris Agreement to be possible. And this was an absolutely essential contribution. Now, China was crucial for the net zero coalition to be formed. Without China, this would not happen. On the other hand, China has announced a number of very important measures. And so what I believe is that China is clearly in the right direction. China is providing leadership. Of course, we always ask for more to everybody. We ask for everybody to intensify their efforts. And one thing that is very important is China is a strong supporter of the developing world. You have the Belt and Road program, you have many other programs of support to the developing world. It's very important to green those programs of support to the developing world, to support renewable energies instead of fossil fuel energy productions, to have resilient infrastructure. So I think China can have a leading role in the international cooperation to be a magnet of attraction of other developing countries to make sure that they invest with the same commitment that China has announced to get net zero emissions, but also to build resilience in their communities. And we are not only asking that to China. I mean, one of the key requests that I make is that developed countries respect the commitments they made in Paris, namely the mobilization of the $100 billion per year to support to mitigation and adaptation of developing countries. And more than that, developed countries assume what is defined in Paris as the common but differentiated responsibilities. The more developed a country is, the more that country was responsible by the past deterioration of the greenhouse situation in the atmosphere, the more a country has to contribute now to support developing countries to be able to resist to the already dramatic impacts of climate change.
What role do you see America playing? President-elect Joe Biden has promised to bring America back into the Paris climate deal. How do you see America's role playing out when it is back in play? And what kind of assurances do you have that America will now stay the course?
Well, first of all, the Paris Agreement would not have been possible if there was not an agreement between, at the time, President Obama and President Xi Jinping that was done before the Paris Agreement and created, I would say, the momentum to make it happen. Of course, many others have contributed and decisively, and of course the French leadership was essential in that process. The UN contributed, but that meeting was essential, which means without the United States and China working together for climate action, we will not be able to mobilize the whole world. So both countries are essential. And the cooperation of the two countries is essential in relation to climate action. Now, I'm encouraged by what was said by the incoming president of the United States, but more than that, the fact that he has appointed John Kerry with a particular responsibility that is unique. I mean, I've never seen that in a cabinet position with a particular responsibility to mobilize all capacities for climate action is encouraging. And so I'm hopeful that China, with the US, but also with Europe, with Brazil, with Japan, with Korea, and hopefully we will need India, we will need Indonesia, we will need Russia, we will need all these countries together, Mexico, I mean, all these countries together, the G20 countries, that represent more than 80% of the emissions, that the G20 will be able to come together and lead this transition to carbon neutrality and this, I would say, common effort to rescue the planet and to make peace with nature.
Now, you've also said along the lines of this that COVID-19 is the crisis of the year, but climate the crisis of the century. But you've also said that COVID recovery and the planet's repair must be two sides of the same coin. What did you mean by that?
It's very simple. We are spending trillions and trillions of dollars for the recovery in relation to COVID-19 and to support the economies. Now, this money needs to be spent in a clear perspective of inclusivity, reducing inequality, addressing the needs of the poor, but also of sustainability, addressing the war with nature and solving it, and making sure that we move into a green economy, that the investments that are made for the future in infrastructure, in energy, in all other aspects are consistent with our objective of carbon neutrality in the middle of the century. And so the opportunity is there. And I would say it would be morally unacceptable because all these investments that are being made, all these trillions that are being mobilized, are increasing our debt. They will be paid by future generations. So we cannot leave to future generations a mountain of debt and a broken planet. We need to make sure that that debt is used to fix the planet too. And so, recovery from COVID and fixing the planet need to be, as I said, and as you mentioned, two faces of the same coin.